but his profile of this being a young, really unsophisticated person, did they take a really hard look at like the other kids in the neighborhood?
No, they never did any neighborhood survey. They never went door to door, which is a huge mistake.
Well, that's not entirely accurate. After the police presentation in June 1998, one of the aspects investigators wanted to examine was JonBenét's friends and the children related to the case. This is really what led to the second police interview with Burke by Dan Schiller. In fact, that was one of the first things the cops did following the police interview. Barely 1 week after the presentation, on June 10th, 11th and 12th, 1998, the police conducted a 3-day interview with Burke Ramsey, which in a sense was arguably an even more in-depth interview with the then 12-year-old than with his parents. And one of the things they wanted to ask about was this.
Investigators focused on a curious finding in the autopsy.
The small intestine is described as containing fragmented fruit material, which may represent fragments of pineapple.
This whole idea of JonBenet eating pineapple suggested that JonBenet was voluntarily with someone else. And John Ramsey at one point suggested it could have been Santa Claus, that she was with Santa Claus, someone basically that she knew, someone that she considered friendly. But of course it could also be another little friend, one of Burke's friends, one of her friends, even Burke. And so of course there were a couple of things to talk to Burke about as well. As you've just seen, the cops knew about pineapple in JonBenet's stomach contents, and that meant, as I say, she didn't go to bed quite how her parents said they did. And so what did he know? What did he know about the bowl of pineapple?
He's going to talk and give a very significant answer about the pineapple that supposedly was found, a bowl of pineapple was found on a table in the house that was not there when everyone went to bed, and pineapple was found during the autopsy in her stomach.
And of course, Burke Ramsey could also explain a few other questions the authorities might have.
We're going to hear him talk. He's going to make a shocking admission about this mystery footprint that people speculate about so much.
That was found at the scene.
Right, at the scene. He's going to talk about the incidents of violence of hitting his sister in the head earlier with a golf club.
Because there was also the heart drawn on the palm of JonBenet's palm. Any idea who could have done that? Wouldn't that have been someone close to JonBenet, familiar with JonBenet, someone that JonBenet trusted? Because Patsy didn't know who drew that. She didn't draw it. And she discouraged that sort of thing. They could also ask Burke whether JonBenet had any special friends, any new special friends. Did he know anything about a secret Santa visit? Also, Burke, what is your opinion on these knots? Have you ever seen them before? But I don't actually want to talk about that in this analysis. In this analysis, we want to talk about the Whites, another group of friends that kind of had a falling out, quite dramatic, with the Ramseys, that was similar and different to the Fernies. And we really want to compare the unraveling of their friendship with the Ramseys to the Fernies, because it was quite different.
My name is Fleet White, and I live in Boulder. My wife Priscilla and I have lived in Boulder since 1994. On Christmas Day, 1996, John and Patsy Ramsey and their children, Burke and JonBenet, were dinner guests at our home. The next day, we were present at the Ramsey home when JonBenet's body was found. Priscilla and I and our children instantly became witnesses in the Boulder police investigation of JonBenet's death.
How does Fleet White open the door and not see it?
I don't know. If that's true, that's a huge red flag. She was right there. I mean,
because you, like, the second you open the door, you see the white
a microsecond.
Doesn't add up.
No, it doesn't. And that's, again, you don't know if that's fiction or fact.
Just like the ransom note, hey John. Now this case could have turned out way, way different if after Fleet White arrived at the house early that morning with his wife Priscilla, when Fleet went down into the basement alone, imagine if he had found JonBenet then. Seriously, imagine that. And if that did happen, I suspect two things would have happened. The Ramseys would have been arrested and questioned in short shrift, but I also think the Ramseys' defense would be, how did Fleet know where JonBenet was? and they'd use this to finger him as a suspect. And his motive? Well, he was jealous of John's success and wanted to frame him. The fact that Fleet had once upon a time changed JonBenét's diapers could also theoretically be used against him. What is clear, though, is that Fleet started to have serious problems with John and the Ramseys, and you can see from this headline how adamant Fleet White was in trying to expose what had really happened. JonBenet case, Fleet White sues for release of grand jury documents accusing girls' parents. A prominent Boulder couple, former close friends of John and Patsy, have filed a lawsuit seeking the full release of long-suppressed documents drafted by a grand jury investigating the 1996 murder of the Ramsey's daughter. Now think about that in comparison to the release of the you-know-what files of late. And I think the reason people are triggered by all of that is this allegation that something happened to JonBenet that was committed by a person older than herself. The critical question is how much older? And was it a family member, a friend of the family member, or a complete stranger? Was it someone that the family brought into the home? Yes or no?
As was publicly revealed last fall, the Ramseys were indicted on felony charges related to JonBenet's death. The indictments, however, were not presented in open court in accordance with Colorado law. Instead, at the conclusion of the grand jury in October 1999, District Attorney Hunter, along with numerous Boulder and Colorado law enforcement and government officials who were privy to the grand jury proceedings, chose to keep the indictments secret.
Indeed. And I have an idea that the testimony from the Whites, very close friends to the Ramseys, real insiders in terms of this case, I have an idea that the testimony from the Whites had a huge impact on the grand jury, just like the testimony of the housekeeper had a huge impact on the grand jury. Did you know, for example, that it was Fleet Jr. who knew that Burke Ramsey had high-tech shoes? So did Burke not know that he had high-tech shoes? Did Patsy not know that Burke had high-tech shoes? Did John not know that Burke had high-tech shoes? But Fleet Jr. did, didn't he?
I mean, so I know you guys don't have much of a relationship now, but like, are those some of the questions, like the hard questions that like, I mean, again, I think this is my friend that I'm going to be like in their face. Tell me how this makes sense.
What I think happened, first of all, I think the police took Fleet away from the home we were in that morning or the day after. And he came back after a couple hours and was different.
We eventually became publicly critical of then Boulder District Attorney Alex Hunter's handling of that investigation. And in 1998 and 1999, we cooperated with prosecutors and gave sworn testimony to the Boulder grand jury. As was publicly revealed last fall, the Ramseys were indicted on felony charges related to JonBenet's death. The indictments, however, were not presented in open court in accordance with Colorado law.
Now we know that the Fernie son also provided some interesting insight into this case. He knew, for example, that Burke owned a set of junior golf clubs. He also knew, for example, that Burke was an early riser, except of course on the day after Christmas. And he probably suggested to Barbara as well, because he often played at the Ramseys' home, how could Burke have remained asleep if Patsy had shouted for the note? It didn't make sense to him because it didn't make sense. But you're getting all of these insights from a little contemporary, a little boy Burke's age, in an insight into that aspect of the Ramsey case. We tend to have adults giving insight into the adult side of it. We don't, at the end of the day, this was the murder of a 6-year-old girl. We're not really getting insights from JonBenet's friends. That's a very neglected area of this case. Now, besides the Whites having doubts, did you know that Bill and Heather Cox, who were guests at the Whites, they were the Whites' special guests at Christmas, they had doubts as well. And Bill Cox made this observation, for example, regarding the Ramsey ransom note. It comes from Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. On the night JonBenet was murdered, the movie Nick of Time aired at 7:30 p.m. on a Boulder cable channel. How many of you knew that? The story centers on an unnamed political faction that kidnaps a 6-year-old girl. The victim is told, listen to me very carefully. Bill Cox, who was staying with Fleet and Priscilla White, told the police that he remembered watching the movie that night. The ransom note begins, "Listen carefully." Now, the Whites were very, very different to the Fernies in many respects. If Barbara Fernie first supported Patsy, only for that support to fizzle behind closed doors, Fleet White was a lot less subtle about it, and the cracks in Fleet's relationship with John appeared early on. The Whites, though media shy, were a lot more involved in the media and the courts and in their open criticism of what was going on than virtually any other insider. Now, I want to come back to John Ramsey saying that Fleet opened the door and didn't see John Bonet, I'm talking about the wine cellar door, and calling that a red flag. I do want to come back to that, but first let's look at the first altercation, essentially, between Fleet and John. Basically, this was the first time that Fleet confronted John. Does anyone know when that happened and where that happened?
Because you guys have like a huge falling out, right? Like,
Well, it was just because it was bizarre. I mean, he came back to Atlanta to attend the funeral, and we made arrangements for our Boulder friends to stay with Atlanta friends in their homes.
John goes on to describe this altercation. I think there was even this idea that someone must put a firearm at arm's reach in case things get really out of hand. And what is really interesting is John, you notice John doesn't actually mention Fleet's name there. I think he's quite concerned and wary that if he does, he could get sued. But in any event, all of this had to do with John going to Atlanta, but specifically going onto CNN instead of staying in Boulder and cooperating with the investigation. Now, why would all of this bother Fleet? Well, because you can imagine Fleet has a vested interest here. Because if the Ramseys skedaddle out of Boulder, who is left to question? Who is left to investigate? Well, the housekeeper and her husband have sort of been excluded pretty quickly. So now the Whites emerge as pretty interesting. They're where the Ramseys go before the incident, and they're there at the incident. Plus, there's Fleet personally escorting Burke out of the house, and also Fleet going down into the basement, which later turns out to be the crime scene. You can imagine why the cops should have plenty of questions for Fleet White. But Fleet really wants the police to question the Ramseys, except they're unavailable week after week, going into month after month.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'd been with him a lot, and I have no doubt that the police used him. Probably said, well, John thinks you killed his daughter and you got to work with us here. Don't know that for a fact, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Now, John says that, but then he seems to be suggesting that the police improperly influenced Fleet, basically saying John thinks you killed his daughter. But when he says that when Fleet opened the door and didn't see John Bonet, that's a huge red flag. What do you think the inference is that we're supposed to draw from that? Something else that John says that I think is interesting in this interview with Ashley Flowers is that I think the Whites and the Ramseys sailed together, and so you could theoretically make an argument that the knots on John Bonet could have been made by someone familiar with sailing knots, right? But in the same way, you could say, well, if Fleet White knew about this knot, so did John Ramsey, and by implication, so did Burke Ramsey. As far as I'm concerned, those aren't knots associated with sailing, although sailing does involve knots, but some other area. How about scouts? And scouts are something that John Ramsey was also involved in, something John Andrew was also involved in, and something Burke Ramsey was also involved in. Was Fleet White a scout? I have no idea, to be quite frank.
Who were privy to the grand jury proceedings chose to keep the indictment secret and then make public pronouncements that were designed to mislead the public to conclude the grand jury had failed to indict.
I want to come back to this confrontation that Fleet had with John in Atlanta, and for that, let's go to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. She knew the police had a list: neighbors, enemies, disgruntled employees, the housekeeper, even poor old Santa Claus from the Christmas party. It could have been anyone. What Patsy's sister Polly noticed at her parents' home, now again, remember when John speaks about this, he doesn't mention Fleet's name, and he mentions a family member, but he doesn't mention which one. Well, it is Polly, Patsy's sister Polly. And Patsy notices at her parents' home that Fleet White is quarreling angrily with her brother-in-law, John. Patsy's standing to one side of them while Fleet hovers over John, telling him that he has to go back to Boulder and help the police. Now, you tell me, is Fleet being unreasonable? You know, this crime happened in Boulder. It's less than a week later, and everyone has decamped to Atlanta. And the police literally have had to fly to Atlanta as well in order to try and keep track of the Ramseys and also to kind of question them. Your job, Fleet told John, is to cooperate with the police, not stonewall them. And that's when John's face reddened. It was obvious that he was too embarrassed to have this conversation in front of his wife and family, but Fleet kept at him. What was this he'd heard about John contacting CNN for an interview? His daughter had just been buried. How could Patsy and John even think about going on television? Again, is Fleet White being completely unreasonable here? Is Fleet White out of line here? And even when Patsy and John do go on TV, what does the public make of this interview? How do they come across in this interview? Even if they wanted to respond to rumors that were going around, a TV appearance was unthinkable. By that point, Fleet had his hands at John's face, but John wasn't saying much. Now, again, why is Fleet so caught up in this? Well, it's possibly because Fleet is taking a lot of heat himself. And also, Fleet is seeing all of this as creating a massive media frenzy, and he's being pulled into it, and he doesn't want to be. And so then the room falls silent. The two friends separate, knowing that they are never going to speak again. So that's how quickly their friendship unraveled. According to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, Fleet White's behavior seemed odd to some of the Ramseys' friends too. Now, let me ask you, what was odd about Fleet White's behavior? If you were in Fleet White's position, wouldn't you have said exactly the same thing? Why are you not in Boulder? Why are you going on CNN? Why aren't you talking to the police? Are any of these things odd or unreasonable? Others at the house felt that Fleet's behavior was so out of character for him that maybe he was involved somehow in John Bonet's death. Now think about what we're dealing with here. There's this idea that could the Ramseys be responsible? Well, now the family members of the Ramseys have found a convenient scapegoat. Let's rather look at Fleet White. And isn't that exactly what happened? And how does Fleet feel about this? Angry. Well, wouldn't you be angry if it was you in that situation? But what I think is really interesting during this intense conflagration is how Nidra, Patsy's mother, emerges as a real battle axe. She's directing the power struggle. She's basically making her presence felt. She's clearly no shrinking violet, just like Patsy wasn't. But Fleet was very different to the Fernies in the sense that, firstly, he seemed to have the support of Priscilla. And by the way, we need to talk about her too, but basically the Whites come across as a united front, whereas the Fernies are, well, less so. Secondly, Fleet didn't just object and grit his teeth and have doubts like Barbara did. He does something about it. And he basically wants Boulder to recognize what's happening in a broader sense. But here's another important difference. When Fleet confronts John, there's a nasty aftermath to that, which is basically that the Ramseys then start to feel that Fleet is behaving strangely, and then Fleet's not only cast out, he's no longer part of the Ramsey circle of friends, but he is also kind of somehow becomes a suspect. And so does Barbara want to be in that situation herself? If Barbara communicates how she feels, well, the reward for that could be that she becomes a suspect as well. Does she want, in other words, the one friend sitting on the sidelines can actually learn from what is happening to the other friends who are being quite vocal about their concerns. Do you want to be too vocal about your concerns if there's this whole media shitstorm that could end up on your doorstep?
and then make public pronouncements that were designed to mislead the public to conclude the grand jury had failed to indict.
If you think about it, there was a lot of misleading things going on, not just in terms of the Ramsey case, but the prosecution of it, including from the district attorney's perspective or position. There also seemed to be a campaign to not only discredit Fleet, but smear him as well. According to the Ramsey Wiki page, in February 2000, listen to this, Hunter did an interview with the Boulder Daily Camera in which he advocated Nancy Krebs' allegations of a pedo ring as a major breakthrough in the case. The article mentioned Fleet White and Fleet White's father by name and detailed Krebs' allegations of violent, you can see the words there, parties involving the White family. Hunter said that he found Krebs' allegations very believable. Hunter made no mention of Krebs' allegations of, you can see what it says there. Boulder police investigated the allegations and determined they were completely false. Now, these are the kind of allegations where just the allegations themselves are incredibly damaging. Even if you discredit them, there are always going to be people who get caught up in the conspiracy and think that where there's smoke, there's fire. They don't just think that someone is blowing smoke up, what. But this is really extraordinary. Hunter's public accusations against Fleet White were later criticized by Detective Steve Thomas. Prosecutor Mike Cain called Hunter's office bemused as to why Hunter was publicly endorsing Krebs, who Cain referred to as a goofball. It was revealed later that Hunter had been repeatedly informed of Krebs' mental problems and credibility issues. Curiously, when Burke Ramsey sued CBS, the Ramseys wanted to call Alex Hunter as a witness, a scenario that, if it was allowed to play out, promised to blow the lid off the Ramsey case. But perhaps surprisingly, perhaps unsurprisingly, Hunter refused to testify. Again, according to the Ramsey Wiki page, CBS issued Hunter with a subpoena to testify in the lawsuit. Hunter objected that it was an annoyance that would interfere with his annual relocation to Hawaii, basically his holiday to Hawaii, and said that cooperating would compromise an open investigation and potential prosecution of the person or persons responsible for JonBenét's death. Now think about those words and Hunter getting so enthusiastically getting involved in these other allegations, how that was interfering, how that was compromising the investigation. In an interview about the matter, Ramsey lawyer Lynn Wood said there was no need for Hunter to testify and referred to the early affidavit in which Hunter had stated that Burke was not a suspect. Wood did not mention that he himself had written that earlier affidavit. CBS ultimately settled the case with the Ramsey's lawyer before it could go to trial, so Hunter did not have to testify. Pretty convenient. And so, if it wasn't settled, wouldn't Hunter have had to testify, and what would that have revealed? I personally believe that Fleet White was right to want the DA and some of his lieutenants removed, and perhaps also Boulder PD. You may remember the only reason Alex Hunter even finally allowed the case to be heard by the grand jury was because he was pressured by the governor, basically forced into doing so. The case probably needed to be tried in Denver or some other jurisdiction. I also believe the reason Alex Hunter was so intimidated by this case wasn't so much because of John Ramsey, but the extremely high-powered legal team, Hal Haddon and his associates, I think scared the bejesus out of Hunter. Hunter may have been in office for some time, but he was way, way, way out of his league in a trial setting with the likes of Hal Haddon. Hunter, when you think about it, was a very unlikely DA to begin with. He went bankrupt in the 70s due to a failed real estate venture. He went $6 million into debt. After that, he was a talk show radio host in the 80s, married 4 times, and his one son died of a drug overdose. Hunter also became DA because he said he would legalize marijuana in a move that catered to the young college community that formed a large part of his constituency. But as a DA, he was remarkable in how few cases he took to trial. Fleet White also posed a serious problem for John Ramsey in 2 areas if the case did go to trial. Firstly, we know that when Fleet opened the basement door, he didn't see anything. It was dark, but he didn't see anything. This part isn't completely clear, but some feel when John did the same thing, when he opened the door and saw JonBenet instantly without turning on the light, well, wasn't that a red flag? Either way, in this situation, these versions are mutually destructive. Only one version can be true. Now, there is some uncertainty about when John turned the light on. Did he turn the light on and then saw JonBenet, or did he see JonBenet then turn the light on? Again, you may notice how careful John is when he talks about the opening of the door. He doesn't mention Fleet's name. He hedges his comment to add that he doesn't know whether it could be true or not. The second issue that Fleet can talk about potentially is the basement window. He didn't seem to notice that it was open or that the basement felt particularly cold. Fleet's solo visit to the basement thus also calls into question a central pillar of the intruder theory, which is how and where the intruder got in. For example, although a tiny piece of glass was found on the suitcase, if it was used as a step to get in or out, why was there no dirt on it beside the suitcase when the area just outside the windowsill was filthy? And that's not all. We all know when it has rained or snowed, stepping into dirt means those leaves, that dirt, really sticks to the bottom of one's shoes. It's so easy to transfer that dirt from the outside to the inside. Why didn't the intruder do that? Why didn't the intruder drop a single pine needle into the area of the basement just below the window? And why didn't he leave a single footprint going in or out? Burke left a footprint in the grout of the wine cellar. Why couldn't the intruder do the same kindness? And then also, what about Priscilla White? What did she know? What did she think? What did she say?
My name is Priscilla White. I live at 455 in Boulder. I am married to Fleet White, who spoke previously on this same matter. In 2002, as some of you may recall, we asked the city for police records regarding the 2000 investigation of Ms. Krebs' claims. To be clear, we seek investigative records from the city that may provide our family vindication from Ms. Krebs' false claims and accusations as detailed in the interview transcriptions publicly released by the court in 2002.
How accommodating would you say the Boulder authorities were in trying to address the Whites' concerns? They simply want to be allowed a chance to show that they are innocent. And to what extent are Boulder facilitating this, do you think? Anyway, I'm not going to take it further than that. I hope you found this interesting. If you did, please do hit the thanks button, and I'll see you guys next time.